occult.com for a reason. When I first read Unholy Alliance, it was in paperback, a small format paperback, and it really was one of the most brilliant books about Nazism I had ever read in my life, that pointed out the occult underpinnings of the Nazi ideas and how this had led from the occult into Nazism and ultimately into the deaths of millions and the destruction of a large part of the human world, its most civilized heart, which has taken, of course, us a very long time to recover, but it hadn't ended there, according to Peter in Unholy Alliance. It had gone on and does continue to go on. Now, his book, Sinister Forces, the most incredible history of the United States I have ever read, bar none. End of story. Welcome, Peter, to Dreamland.
Thank you very much for having me, Whitley.
Peter, tell us, if you will, to begin, and we're going to float back and forth through history, folks, with this. You call this book, Sinister Forces, a grimoire of American political witchcraft. And we'll get to why you call Book 1 the Nine in a few minutes. But what is a grimoire?
Well, a grimoire is a book of spells. It's a book of rituals used by magicians, normally used for raising spirits or for doing almost anything a magician would do. I use it here in this case because I feel that it's a collection of information concerning cults that have been involved in American history over the years. And it's also a kind of a guide to some of the occult beliefs and practices that I think exist in this country in official and semi-official and unofficial ways. So it pretty much covers a wide range of spiritual techniques and practices that I believe were being utilized by, for instance, American intelligence during the infamous MKUltra affairs, by the military as well during some of the same types of research into mind control, brainwashing, psychological warfare, that sort of thing.
It's a world that I have had a lot to do with in different ways. It has affected me, tried in a sense to capture me as a child, sent itself after me in different ways. I have been negatively affected by it. I want to know this. Why is it, let's get down to exactly what makes what you call the occult so dangerous. And why is it different from, for example, ancient nature religions and that sort of thing?
Well, that's a good question. I think that people reading my books quickly may come away with the opinion that I'm completely against the occult, and this is not so, but I am against the use of occult techniques by people with hidden agendas or ulterior motives, or people who are simply not trained well enough to understand what they're doing, as was the case with the people working under the CIA mind control operations in the military. They were in the same area, they were working in the same field, consciously or unconsciously, deliberately or not, as occultists have been for thousands of years, going back to the earliest recorded rituals that we know of ancient Egypt or Sumeria. So what we have is a spiritual process involving initiation, involving spiritual awareness, being forced upon victims, being forced upon people in a kind of gleeful experimentation just to see what would happen. To me, what was going on with American intelligence in the 50s, 60s, and until the present day is a kind of dramatic attempt to use magic, to use mysticism, to use all the techniques of the shamans and of the early nature religions in an effort to break open the human mind and to manipulate people, just as the way it was believed that magicians and witches during the Middle Ages were controlling people's minds or controlling people's destinies. CIA was researching all of the same material, as has been documented quite carefully, even in the sparse documents that have come out about MKUltra. It's obvious that they were working in the same territory, and there are a lot of victims. People who've suffered under this because there was no spiritual preparation, there was no follow-up, there was no attempt to create better people out of this. there was only an attempt to get the magical powers, which, as anyone knows, anyone will tell you, is a kind of black magic. When you pursue spiritual power for its own sake, just to have power over others, this is considered the very darkest form of spirituality. As they will tell you in India, in China, in the ancient religious techniques of shamanism, you pursue these things to better your community, to better yourself, to improve your relationship to the divine. You may obtain powers, abilities, psychic abilities along the way, but you should not pursue occultism for that purpose or for that sake. With CIA and with the military in our country and in other countries around the world, we're not the only ones, an attempt was made to look at this from a very behavioristic point of view. The scientists said, well, let's take all of this out of its religious context, out of its spiritual context, and see what we can do with it. Can we erase memory? Can we manipulate memory? Can we take over the will of an individual? Can we make a person do things they wouldn't ordinarily do, and then erase the memory of it? These were things CIA admitted in 1975 that they had tried to do. So, to me, this is a form of occultism run amok. Occultism in the hands of government agents. What is the worst combination you can think of but a spiritual movement in the hands of government bureaucrats?
Now, did they simply not believe that anything else was there in this? And here's how I mean that. I have gained a lot of those powers, frankly. I've written about this in my journals, some on my website. I do not use them in this way at all, and never would use them to influence another person. And I'm in a very difficult position now, because I know that I could use them to influence certain people in high places, but who are doing things wrong. But should I? And that's a moral question I really haven't answered yet, because I do know there is something back there. There is something behind the curtain that will use me if I use it. Did the CIA people, were they aware of this presence, if you will, at all, or were they simply so secular that they were blind to it and just experimenting like kids let loose in a candy shop that turned out to be full of poison pills?
Well, I think that they began as sorcerers' apprentices, basically, if we remember the Walt Disney film. I think they began trying to make the brooms dance, and in the end they found themselves surrounded by the fallout of what they were doing. I don't think initially they realized what they were up to. I think they had a purely behavioristic approach, a purely mechanical approach to the human mind, and they said, let's open it up and see what we can see. And there had been other groups, organizations, and traditions down through the ages that claimed to have these abilities or powers or these technologies. And CIA said, let's go and take a look and see what we can do. I don't think they understood or recognized that there is a spiritual aspect to this, that there could be spiritual fallout. I don't think they cared. I mean, if we look at the experimentation by Dr. Cameron in Montreal, for instance, with all of his sleep deprivation and sensory deprivation experiments, his psychic driving experiments, he just drove people insane. He attempted to erase their memories and to rebuild other memories, to instill new memories. He did this without compunction. He thought he was doing a good thing. I mean, he was the president of the World Psychiatric Association, for crying out loud. So here was someone that we held above reproach, who felt he was doing nothing wrong by reducing his patients to quivering masses of jelly. I mean, he had no conscience where this was concerned. So I don't think CIA really understood what they were up to. I think that they felt that this was mechanical and that whatever was broken they could fix. And of course, this is not true. I mean, the documents were destroyed. We don't know the people they worked upon. We don't know the names of these patients. They subjected violent offenders to massive amounts of hallucinogenic drugs and other types of mental and psychological conditioning, and then destroyed the records. So we don't know who's out there, what they're suffering from, or what this fallback is, and nobody at CIA seems to care about this, quite frankly, unless they're caught, as in the Frank Olson case or something like that. Nobody
Tell us about the Frank Olson case.
Well, Frank Olson was a scientist working with the military and with CIA out at Fort Detrick, which is where we did a lot of our chemical and biological warfare research. And this was in 1953. He was dosed with a small amount of LSD by Sidney Gottlieb, who at that point was working for the CIA in charge of their technical services division, which was experimenting with mind control technologies. And Olson was only one of several scientists who were, unknown to them, dosed with LSD in their Cointreau. Something happened to Frank Olson. He became extremely paranoid after this. He became very depressed. He wanted out of the military program that he was in. He had told his wife he made a terrible mistake. And with days of going around and telling everyone he wanted out, he was dead. He was thrown from a window in his hotel room in New York City and fell 10, 11 stories to his death. The death was covered up. It was considered a suicide until finally they revealed the information much, much later. CIA was forced to admit that he had been one of their mind control subjects. His family sued the government, and his son, Eric Olson, is still agitating for a reopening of the case because an autopsy performed not too long ago on Frank Olson shows that he was murdered. He did not commit suicide. So this is only one case. Several other cases since then have turned up from the 50s. And our fear is that there are many more cases waiting to be exposed from the 1960s and 1970s.
Well, I believe that in 1977, Richard Helms, among the documents he destroyed in that year, he destroyed most, if not all, of the documents having to do with children, but that the program continued on. We're going to be going back and forth across history with Peter Levenda over the course of this program. We're going to go all the way back to witchcraft before Salem in the United States and all the way forward to the immediate future. So strap yourselves in, folks. It's going to be awesome. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Whitley Strieber's Dreamland online and on the IBC Radio Network.
This is Whitley Strieber. We're back with Peter Levenda. We were talking about a CIA mind control case, the Olson case, where it's now been proved that this man who allegedly committed suicide by jumping out of a window actually was murdered, almost certainly by the CIA. A little word has been used in the course of this conversation. That word has been the word secular. Secular, Peter, is, I've always felt, a profoundly disempowering word. The people who get into this, who open the door into the mind and therefore also into the world of the soul, who think of themselves as simply secular experimenters, are disempowering themselves and rendering themselves helpless. They are the sorcerer's apprentice. How do you react to that?
Well, I agree. If we insist on calling these procedures mechanistic, if we insist on looking at these types of techniques as strictly scientific, with all that implies in the modern day, then what we are doing is we're robbing these experiments of what they were really up to, what they were really doing, of what they really consist. Experimentation on the human mind is crossing right over into the territory of spirituality, of religion, of mysticism, of all the things that give meaning to our experience. Science is not a study of meaning whatsoever. Science and the secular approach is what goes up must come down. It's the laws of physics, the laws of nature, but there's no meaning associated with it. To cross over into the study of the human mind, you are now in the area of meaning. And when you start manipulating a person's memory, when you start manipulating their reality, when you play games with the contents of a person's psyche, you are challenging the meanings upon which that person bases their life. They become extremely disoriented. Their spiritual path, their internal path of the soul has been completely disrupted. They don't know in which direction they're going any longer. A spiritual initiation is supposed to put you on the path and empower you. But if you use the techniques of spiritual initiation without the spirituality, all you're doing is you're creating a kind of ticking time bomb. You're creating a killer, or you're creating a person who will become extremely depressed, extremely paranoid, a person who will question their role in life, question their existence. And then you do that and walk away. You take no responsibility for what happens to that person. And that, to me, is a terribly dangerous thing to do, not just to the victim, but it's a terribly dangerous thing for the experimenter to do, because they've taken on a spiritual responsibility and totally neglected it. They don't even acknowledge that it exists. And that could be a modern-day definition of black magic.
I think it is a modern-day definition of black magic. I think it's a very well-put modern-day definition of black magic. Now, I want to go back to the underpinnings, to the beginnings of this country, but I don't want to do it just to go straight back to the pre-Salem world. Instead, let's go back through the mind of a writer, a remarkable writer who's fascinated me for many years, H.P. Lovecraft. I actually wrote a book. I was friends with Bob Bloch, the author of Psycho, and Bob and I were hanging out one evening, and we were talking about Lovecraft. We both were fascinated by Lovecraft, by the incredible atmospheric idea of sort of the old ones that he had, these strange, misshapen creatures from a past so long ago that the nature of physics was different and the nature of creation was different, and they were constructed in a completely different way with different motives and different spirits. Could you write a whole novel? Lovecraft had only written short books of short stories, long as short stories about them, a whole novel. And so I set out and I wrote a novel called The Forbidden Zone, which Bob, unfortunately, we didn't bet money. Bob didn't have any much more than I did, so it was no big deal. But we didn't even bet a quarter, or maybe we could have gone $10. I mean, we're writers, remember. Writers are supposed to be
right.
endlessly rich, but I think you know the reality of that. Stephen King and a few others are, but most of us are kind of scraping along anyway. I wrote The Forbidden Zone based on Lovecraft's work, and I've used this story to set the scene about who Lovecraft was living up there in Rhode Island. Why, Peter, did a man like Lovecraft sense this presence so strongly in America? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, Lovecraft is a fascinating individual. He was a kind of a crank on one hand, and on the other, he was a visionary. Here was a man who claimed not to believe in anything that was mystical or occult. He claimed to be a pure scientist where that was concerned, a pure rationalist, and yet he lived very close to the forces that he wrote about. If we talk about the area in which he lived, in northern Rhode Island and Providence, and in the areas that he traveled in southern Massachusetts, we're talking about some of the ancient territories that had been populated by people long before the people we know as Native Americans lived there. He believed that ancient Druidic cults, or cults even prior to the Druids, had somehow come to America and set up shop there, that there were cults that had existed there from time immemorial. And oddly enough, in the last 50 or 60 years or so, we've uncovered evidence that perhaps Lovecraft was not entirely wrong, that he sensed that there was something genuine that really did exist in the New England landscape. We have evidence of people from Europe and North Africa visiting the United States or visiting the American continent long before its discovery by Columbus. And in fact, in some cases, long before the Native Americans had actually populated those regions that we know of today. So there were Indian burial mounds. There were strange monoliths that were set up according to the solstices and the equinoxes to worship the rising of the sun. There have been stones found with inscriptions that harken back to ancient Israel, for instance, or the Phoenicians. So Lovecraft lived at a time when there was the beginning of a lot of exploration of America, of what may have happened in America long before the Native American tribes had populated the region. The Native Americans themselves referred to the old people, or the old ones, which was a favorite epithet of Lovecraft for the races that existed before humans lived on the planet. So he seemed to have touched something. He touched a nerve somehow. And it has been recognized since then by leading occultists such as Kenneth Grant in England, who believes that Lovecraft really did experience something of a spiritual reality and expressed it through his works, although he refused to admit it, even to the end of his days. It's a fascinating story that Lovecraft, as the cranky New England author of Gothic horror, would have actually intuitively understood that America had been inhabited by races that were much older, and that rituals have been performed in this country that date back to the ancient Middle East, for instance, or to the ancient Druidic cultures. So America did not begin in 1492. America didn't start its history then. I think that we have to rewrite a little bit of American history and start teaching in the schools to people who lived here before. The mound builder culture, for instance, that goes back to the time of Buddha, to 800 BC. The Adena culture, the Hopewell culture, all of these so-called Indian or Native American cultures that showed a vast capacity for building huge cities, for building observatories of the stars, of the planets, of the sun and the moon. I mean, things that we expect from Stonehenge and we don't realize exist in our own country and haven't been here, were here long before the first settlers came from Europe. So there's a lot of fascinating material that I think we don't know about our country, we don't appreciate. We tend to think of 1492 as the watermark, as the beginning of civilization in America, and that's hardly true. Civilization was here for at least 1,000 to 2,000 years before Columbus ever set foot here. And some of that civilization might have been European or Middle Eastern in nature as well.
I'll give it I want to give it a certain different perspective. I agree with you entirely. I agree with you completely. I think that what we're actually doing when we look at America from 1492 on, and this is the beginning of European culture in America and so forth, is we're really looking at an illusion, the beginning of the process of the secularization of the power, of the occult power of this land. And this is an illusion and a dangerous illusion. By the way, those of you who have read my journals, and my most recent couple of journals, and you know a couple of things about me, you know now, and I'm admitting it, that I do have ended up with a certain amount of so-called occult power. There's only one thing to do with this, and that is to surrender yourself to the will of God as best you can. You cannot go out and manipulate it, because it is not there to be manipulated any more than a lion is there to be manipulated by a mouse. No matter how good you are not going to win. You can't win doing this. There's a great, huge gulf of difference between the ancient nature religions with their respect for, love of, and awareness of the spirit of the earth and the spirit of the land, and those occultists who attempt to break down the door or break down the wall between us and this other realm and to use its powers among men. You can't do it. It's not to be done. It's a tremendous temptation because it looks like it works. It looks like it works, but it does not work, except against you. I think we've opened a door in this country. The innocent secular children working through the CIA and in other ways have opened a door in this country, the same door that the Nazis opened. And when we get back talking to Peter, we're going to talk about the similarities between the door opened by Karl Haushofer and ultimately which Adolf Hitler walked through, and the door opened by Richard Helms and the CIA in the United States years later, using in some cases some of the very same men, all of them victims of the dark side. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Whitley Strieber's Dreamland online and on the IBC Radio Network.
This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We're talking to Peter Levenda. His book, Sinister Forces, available in bookstores, available from unknowncountry.com. Get it from us. First of all, you get one of the best deals going because we are cheap, cheap, cheap. Plus, if you're a subscriber, you get even more off, 10% more off just for subscribing to unknowncountry.com. So keep this alive. It's the one voice. There's no voice like it in the world. Nothing else is like this. Keep us going. Subscribe, buy Peter's book, learn, because I will tell you this. The truth is in that book, and the truth will make you free. It will make you free. You don't even have to do anything. If you know the truth, if you know it, that is power against this monster. Peter, let's go back, and I want you to tell me about the beginnings of Nazism in the work of Aleister Crowley and Madame Blavatsky, and how it was interpreted by Karl Haushofer and became the underpinnings of Nazi theology, as it were, and doctrine. And then we're going to talk about the entrance of this power into the United States via the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Yes, sir. Go ahead, Peter. I know you've got a lot to say.
Oh, yeah. Well, to begin with Blavatsky formed something called the Theosophical Society in 1875 in New York City. That was the same year Aleister Crowley was born. Of course, he was born in England. Crowley then later, of course, became a kind of theosophist, but even then theosophy wasn't enough for him, and then we can talk about that. But Blavatsky had a unique appreciation or understanding of human history, or of the great cycles of human history, which he claimed to have gotten from India and Tibet. And that was the concept of races. Blavatsky believed that every new age had its own race, had its own evolved form of humanity, that humanity formed in cycles over huge amounts of time, and that each new race was superior to the one that preceded it. This was a kind of Darwinism. You might call it a kind of social Darwinism, where the survival of the fittest influenced heavily a lot of thinkers at that time. So this was a kind of way of keeping spirituality alive in the face of Darwin. Darwin, of course, had challenged Christian concepts of evolution because in terms of Christianity and fundamentalist Christianity, the world was created in 6 days. On the seventh day, God rested, and that whole thing only happened a few thousand years ago. Darwin, of course, challenged all of that with his theory of evolution. Blavatsky's brilliance was in trying to accommodate Darwin and at the same time create a kind of spiritual analysis of Darwinism. This idea of races and of spiritual progress of the race and of a superior race that was yet to come was embraced wholeheartedly in Nazi Germany, long before Nazi Germany long before the Nazis were in power in Germany. There was a scientific movement called eugenics, and eugenics was designed to perfect the human race by weeding out the undesirables. Of course, we can figure out how dangerous that concept might be, who's undesirable and who decides who's undesirable. This eventually became, however, doctrine within Nazi Germany. The idea of an Aryan race, which was first mentioned by Blavatsky, who first popularized the use of the swastika as the emblem of the Aryan race, was embraced by the Nazis. This is not to say that theosophy is satanic or that theosophy is Nazi or fascist in origins or belief, but those beliefs did give rise quite easily to what the Nazis believed. They said, okay, we're going to take theosophy and its belief about races and its belief about evolution and put it into practical use.
Now Peter, let me just stop for a minute.
Yes.
This is the danger. This is the danger of the occult right here. Madame Blavatsky would have been horrified to see what the Nazis did with her ideas.
Absolutely.
But the ideas are linked to something very dark, because if you take the ideas out to their logical conclusion, you come to death and destruction, the tower of destruction. That's what the Nazis did. There's another road into this. That is the royal road through secularism into ruin by ignorance, and we'll get to that in a minute. But please continue, Peter.
Yes, well, I agree. Blavatsky would have been horrified. This was not what she had intended. She had intended a kind of marriage of science and religion with theosophy, and unknowingly unleashed this evil upon the world because the Nazis embraced this concept. I mean, it was logical. They said, let's just follow this to its logical conclusion, as you said, and let's weed out all the inferior races, and we will have the super race in control of the world in a very short time. within decades, as far as Hitler's timetable was concerned. Once Europe was subjugated, then he would go on to Africa and the Far East, and it was only a matter of time. So we can see how easily occult and mystical ideas can be embraced by political movements and military movements without even the people being aware of this. In general, the people of Germany, I think, were not so aware of the occult or mystical aspects of their leaders or the strange things in which they believed, but they went along with it because to them the whole process sounded pretty logical. So they went along with a lot of these things. They joined the SS. Many of them were perfectly all right in running the death camps because they felt this was all for a greater good. And as soon as we talk about doing things for a greater good, we're in dangerous territory. When we say that the ends justify the means, we're in dangerous territory. And that's what happens with a lot of our own programs in this country. When the war was over, when the Nazis had been defeated, these people were true believers. The Nazis did not simply give up once the war was over and say, okay, you got us, you know, we're going to abandon all those beliefs that we held so dearly for so many years, for 20 years, 30 years in some cases. We're going to abandon all of this and become strong, upstanding citizens. That didn't happen. The Nazis were true believers. They had been indoctrinated. The SS men in particular had been thoroughly indoctrinated. They were not going to surrender their beliefs. So when we brought them to this country, and we brought them in under Operation Paperclip, and some of the other operations that never got a name, and what we did is we brought a virus into our country. We brought these people with their strange beliefs, with their insidious, anti-human beliefs, and we put them in charge of our scientific apparatus. We put them in charge of our space program. We put them in charge of medical experimentation. We idolized these people because of the way they were able to experiment in their own country without any strictures. They could experiment on humans without any problem, and the data was valuable. So we brought the people over, we brought their data, we installed them in our own positions of power in our own country, and we never denazified these people.
Never denazified them, and we couldn't because we were secular. You cannot denazify anybody with secularism. It's not possible.
Of course not.
I mean, you can do it logically, but unless we heed the words of one of the most powerful, as it were, if you could even, I hate even to use the word anti, but one of the most powerful battlers on behalf of God in the world has ever known, Meister Eckhart, we can only sink deeper into this quicksand. And he said, become as a clear glass through which God can shine. Let me paint another slightly different picture. I know, Peter, you've read my journal entry on the roots of Nazism in America and how it entered modern politics. Yes. Let's now go back to the late 40s. The house on the hill, my father's house. Here he is, a man who spent his war years working in South Texas among Nazis, trying to discover and understand and help the government stop the flow of dollars and gold from Texas into Mexico to Nazi Germany, which was a continuous flow throughout the war. And then on Elizabeth Road, then the next block over, Tuttle Road, a group of little houses are built down in the kind of gully, and into these houses come numerous Air Force personnel and paperclip scientists brought there because Dad's expertise in following the Nazis during the war in South Texas continues to be used, even though he's now he's outside of the military, and he is, then this thing reaches out and bites at his child, leaving me in the position I'm in now of being tempted by these occult powers at a time when I can see the actions of this force actually taking over the government of the United States and leading us down the road to destruction. And I have to tell you, God seems extremely passive but I know that if I act in the way it wants me to act, I will only also get sucked up in the quicksand. Now, how should people like me in this position act, Peter? What do you think we should do?
Well, I think that what you're saying is absolutely right. If you try to take deliberate action of the type that you feel impelled to do, you are going to open up simply more channels and possibly be manipulated by the very forces that you're trying to combat. That's a serious problem. It requires greater and greater levels of initiation, to use an occult term, to be able to understand how to use the power in a way that is the most beneficial and the least dangerous to yourself and others. The power itself is seductive. I mean, that's the whole point. And to be led down the path of using it is considered by some organizations to be black magic in the sense of evil. So it requires a great deal of restraint not to fall down the path, because what happens when you do is the ego becomes inflated and you begin to imagine that you're all powerful and that the decisions that you make are good, no matter what decisions they may happen to be. And this is what's happened to many cult leaders over even within recent memory, people like Jim Jones and David Koresh and people like that, who have felt that because they had the power, because they felt the charisma, the gift, as we say, they felt they could do no wrong. And actually the power is only an initial stage. It's only a preliminary stage to greater understanding and greater initiation.
Yes.
So I think your idea of becoming a clear glass, as Eckhart said, is probably the safest thing to do and the most beneficial to the rest of us.
And I'm hoping that by pursuing this educational program that I call Dreamland, that I'm doing just that, because I feel like education and understanding are the key. Shine a light where it's dark. When we get back, we're going to be talking with Peter about certain people, Jack Parsons, L. Ron Hubbard, Aleister Crowley, I'm sure you know who he is, and how they figure in the occult underpinnings and the secret history of America. We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We're talking to Peter Levenda, what I regard as one of the most important programs I have ever put on the air. I want you to let your friends know about this. Don't hide your interest in unknown country because you're embarrassed in some way about being interested in these edge subjects. You'd be surprised at how open people will now be to looking at this. People who were not open even 5 years ago or 2 years ago will be open, and they need to know this, and you need to understand this. You need the profound understanding that comes from Sinister Forces. Don't miss it. Pick it up. Get it from the unknowncountry.com store. However you get it, get the darn thing. It's terribly, terribly important. It will open your eyes about the nature of experience in America and where we are now and where we are about to go and must not go. We must not go. This place has been the magnet and the sun of freedom for the world for a long time. They are trying to kill that. They are trying to put out that light that is in every single heart of every single person listening to this program and of every single American. Don't let them put out the light. And you know who they are. You certainly do. Okay. Let's go back to the middle of the century and talk first about Jack Parsons and the OTO, and then we'll get into Hubbard and Crowley and how all of this works and how it opened doors that once they're opened, they cannot be closed except by reference to the divine. Go ahead.
Well, to talk about Parsons, we kind of have to talk about Crowley. Aleister Crowley, as most of your listeners would know, I think was a magician of the 20th century. He was heavily influenced by Blavatsky's writings, by Theosophy, but he wanted to become more active and became involved in an organization called the Golden Dawn, a British occult society. That was very influential in England at the time, which numbered William Butler Yeats as one of its members, for instance, Florence Farr, a famous actress at the time, and a lot of other people who were influential in the arts and in culture. even then, Aleister Crowley was not 100% satisfied with the Golden Dawn, even though the Dawn was involved in ritual magic and initiations. Crowley felt that he had some superior understanding and superior abilities. He became involved with a lot of other organizations in Europe, one of which was the OTO. Now, the OTO practiced a kind of magic, Masonic rituals, which were combined with an understanding of the sexual allegories behind alchemy, Rosicrucianism, and a lot of the other Hermetic beliefs and ideas of the time. This appealed to Crowley very much, of course. So as Crowley was involved with the OTO, as he was becoming its leader or a leader of one of its branches after the death of its founder, he established OTO organizations around the world. One of them was in California, in Pasadena. It was called the Agape Lodge of the OTO, agape being the Greek word for a love feast. And at this lodge, we find ourselves surrounded by a lot of science fiction authors and people who were attracted to fantasy and science fiction in California in the 1940s. And one of these was Jack Parsons. Jack Parsons was a brilliant rocket engineer. He performed some invaluable service for the United States during World War II by discovering types of fuel that could be used to store missiles on board ship, fuel that would not degrade with time and would not explode accidentally. So he was a brilliant person. There's a crater on the moon named after Jack Parsons. That's how important he was. But on the other side, he was also very involved with the OTO, with ritual magic, and at one point identified himself with the Antichrist. So we have on one side a brilliant scientist working for our government during the war years. On the other side, he is a kind of satanic figure. He believes he's the Antichrist. He's setting himself up against Christianity, against organized religion of all kinds, against the government even. So he became a dangerous person. As he was involved with the OTO, as he was involved with ritual magic, he made the acquaintance of another science fiction writer. There were a number of them attracted to the lodge in Pasadena at the time. And one of these was a man called Hubbard, L. Ron Hubbard. Now, most people discussing Scientology do not know of the origins of Scientology at this lodge in Pasadena just right after the end of World War II. In 1945, 46, 47, we find Hubbard and Parsons very friendly, working rituals together in the Mojave Desert, trying to summon various beings to existence. Parsons was always in trouble with girlfriends. He was constantly losing his girlfriends to other members of the OTO. So he was actually performing rituals to attract another wife or another girlfriend or a partner in occult workings. And he did this with Hubbard.
Folks, don't even think about doing it. Don't even think about using this power for seemingly innocent or what you believe to be good ends. It does not work that way. It's there to trick you. Go ahead, Peter.
Well, I mean, the Parsons case is a good case in point. What happened to Parsons was pathetic. Hubbard eventually stole his money, stole his girlfriend, decamped to Miami, Florida, on a business venture that he was supposed to be buying boats for a Parsons-Hubbard enterprise, but of course he simply disappeared with the cash and with the girl. Parsons had to go to Miami to try to retrieve some of his money back, got very little back, and eventually was destroyed by the experience. He was spied on by the FBI because they thought he was a security risk, which quite possibly might have been true. And eventually, in the early 1950s, Hubbard died tragically. The girlfriend that he had acquired during this magical working was going to leave with him to go to Mexico. He also had plans to go to Israel
Parsons
to help him.
Died tragically.
Jack Parsons, yeah.
Yeah, you said Hubbard.
Jack Parsons did. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, well, Parsons lost his girlfriend to Hubbard, but his current girlfriend, the one he obtained during the magical working, was going to go with him to Mexico. On the day that they were supposed to leave, Hubbard blew up in his laboratory. The official word was that he dropped a very volatile explosive and accidentally blew himself up. Since then, there's been a lot of evidence to show that probably Parsons was murdered, that the explosion came from under the floorboards from where he was standing. So there's a lot of controversy over Parsons' death. But here was a brilliant man, intellectually very brilliant, who became involved with the occult, who died tragically, who had a life of misery, basically, after he became involved with the occult. If that's not a cautionary tale, I don't know what is. He's now considered quite a saint by the Crowley people and by the OTO. He's considered one of their shining stars because obviously he's probably the most famous of all the OTO people after Crowley. I mean, after all, the crater on the moon. Jack Parsons was one of the people who founded the Jet Propulsion Laboratory at Caltech, which, as we all know now, is part of our space program. So,
and which, no matter how secular they pretend they are, and they say they are, and how little they believe and consider Jack Parsons' nonsense, the energy has flowed into it. It is there.
Well, certainly. I mean, there are people who believe that the rituals conducted by Hubbard and Parsons were somehow connected with the beginning of the UFO phenomenon in 1947. From an occult point of view, all of these events are related. And in my book, I discuss how that is. It's kind of tedious going through the details, but
it's not tedious. Folks, reading the book is like skiing on fire. I'm telling you. There's nothing tedious, and he's alluding to one of the areas of this book that is absolutely mind-boggling. Peter, we're getting ready to come to the end of Dreamland, the Dreamland portion of our discussion. And folks, what we're going to do in the subscriber section is we're going to begin to discuss what Peter calls deep politics and the JFK assassination. You will never read anything quite like what Peter has written in Chapter 7 of Sinister Forces about the JFK assassination. So if you're not a subscriber, at least get the book and read Chapter 7 for certain. Do not gloss this over. This is important stuff. Peter, we have about a minute and a half left of Dreamland, so you're really kind of on the spot now because you've got to bring us to the great concluding message of, and I think actually, now that it occurs to me, maybe it'd be a good idea in a few weeks when you have time to come back to Dreamland. And would you be willing to do that?
Absolutely.
Oh, wonderful. Well, we'll have Peter back on Dreamland in a couple of weeks. But in any case, where are we now, Peter? What happened to our country? We're trapped in this, I think.
Well, we are. We got seduced into a mindset where we're willing to give up our liberties, and our liberties, not just our liberties as citizens, but in a sense our spiritual liberties as well, in exchange for security. And when that happens, as it happened in Germany in the 30s, what you get is the government you deserve. It's a government that becomes all-powerful and protects you from so many things that what's the most protected place in the world is a prison. I mean, we're by opening up our minds to spiritual forces without protection, without an understanding of the initiatory process, what we have done is we've allowed forces that we don't understand to run rampant. What we have to do is get that control back. We've got to understand what we've done, who's doing it, why they're doing it, and we have to exert control over our own souls, our own spirits as best as we can. I mean, it's a psychic self-defense process that we have to get involved with now, I believe.
Peter Levenda, Sinister Forces. This is Dreamland. We'll be back with Linda Moulton Howe in just a moment.
You're listening to Whitley Strieber's Dreamland online and on the IBC Radio Network.
You're about to experience something that you just can't get elsewhere. Emmy Award-winning science reporter Linda Moulton Howe reporting on the absolute leading edge of science discovery and the true mysteries of the unknown. Don't miss her website, earthfiles.com, the one science website that tells you the secrets the others dare not. earthfiles.com. This week, she's reporting on Planet X and other objects way out there in the solar system. Here she is from Albuquerque, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thanks, Whitley. It was a couple of months ago in late July that astronomer Michael Brown and his colleagues at the California Institute of Technology announced their discovery of Planet X. It's a big chunk of rock and ice 9 billion miles from the sun. It's actually bigger than Pluto and far beyond Pluto in what is known as the Kuiper Belt that circles our solar system. Now, almost 2 months later, the International Astronomical Union still has not decided if this exciting discovery should be classified a planet or what its official name should be. And overlooked in all of the 10th planet headlines was the discovery of 2 other very unusual objects. All 3 were given private slang names by Dr. Brown and his team so they could keep them straight. First, Planet X, the scientists call it Xena, after the TV warrior princess. The astronomical designation is 2003 UB313. Now you can see why they called it Xena. The second object is affectionately called Santa because it was discovered near Christmas 2003. Its astronomical designation is 2003 EL61. The third object is called Easter Bunny because it was discovered this year at Easter time. Its astronomical designation is 2005 FY9. Santa and Easter Bunny are both about 4.5 billion miles from the sun, or only half the distance that Xena is. And a surprise to astronomers, Xena and Easter Bunny have a surface very similar to Pluto's. All 3 are covered with frozen methane. These new additions to our solar system were detected at Palomar Observatory in California. And this week, I asked Dr. Brown how he tracked them down.
We take a picture of a specific region of the sky each night, and we take another picture an hour and a half later, and we take one more picture an hour and a half after that. And we compare these 3 pictures, and when we compare the 3 pictures, there are many hundreds of thousands of stars and hundreds of thousands of galaxies in each picture, and they all are stationary with respect to each other. And occasionally we find things in the solar system, and those things in the solar system move. Mm-hmm. And by looking at their motion, we can figure out exactly how far away they are, and also by seeing how bright they are, we can figure out how big they are. These things out in the Kuiper Belt and beyond the Kuiper Belt move very, very slowly. So they almost look like stars when you look at them because they're just a little point of light and they're not moving. But if you look over the course of 3 hours, you see a very small motion, and you realize that they're actually within our solar system.
And that is how you came to find Xena, Santa, and Easter Bunny?
That's exactly right. We've been doing this now for about 7 years, and it sounds simple. The trick is that to find these things, we've had to cover almost the entire sky. We're about halfway done with the whole sky now. And so it's a long and in many ways tedious process, night after night, looking at different patches of the sky, looking for these things. But the payoff is big.
Well, could you start with that mysterious object that you're calling Xena currently, and in July was being referred to by the general media as possibly Planet X, meaning the 10th planet in the solar system?
It's a very exciting object. It's the first thing that's ever been found out in the Kuiper Belt that's bigger than Pluto, which is why we call it the 10th planet. It's still under debate as to exactly whether astronomers will call it a planet or not, but it seems pretty reasonable that if we all agree that Pluto is a planet, that if you find something bigger and further out, that it's going to be called a planet too. And it's scientifically a very exciting object. It's about 3 times further away than Pluto is, so it's amazingly cold out there. It's somewhere near 400 degrees below zero. And based on some detailed studies we've done with the Gemini Observatory on Mauna Kea in Hawaii, we see that the surface of it is made out of the same sort of material that the surface of Pluto is made out of. And what that is frozen solid methane. Methane here on the Earth is in the atmosphere, and it's a gas that smells bad. But when you put it out at those temperatures, it freezes out of the atmosphere and just sits on the surface. And so we now have a way of studying how these objects react to these extreme cold temperatures, extreme distances away from the sun. And scientifically, we're quite excited about that.
And would it have any rocky part, the way we think of a planet?
We think so. We don't know the answer to this yet, although there's a hope that we will be able to know eventually. We know that Pluto is made out of maybe half rock and half ice. And because the rock is heavier, most of the rock is probably near the center. It's sort of like the Earth, where the Earth is made out of rock and then the center is molten iron, because the iron is heavier than the rock, so it all sinks to the bottom. Out at Pluto and then out at this 10th planet, the rock sinks down to the bottom and the outer shell will be ice. So right now all we see is the outer shell of the ice. To understand if there really is that rocky core, which we think there probably is, you need to be able to measure the mass of the planet and say, hey, this has a mass somewhere between ice and rock, so we know that there's some rock down in there.
Now, how do you do that?
The only way to measure the mass from far away is to hope that it has a moon. If it has a moon, you can follow the moon over the course of its orbit, and based on how far away the moon is and how fast it's going around the planet, you can figure out the mass of the planet. The more massive the planet is, the faster the moon will spin around it. And that's what was done hundreds of years ago to figure out the mass of Jupiter, for example, when its moons were discovered, and figure out the mass of Saturn. And that's how we know the mass of Pluto. Pluto, of course, has the large moon Charon around it, so we know the mass of Pluto. And if we're lucky, this new planet's going to have a moon too, and we'll be able to figure out what the mass is that way.
Now, what about this definition of a planet? If this were an all-icy body, then does it deserve to be called only a Kuiper Belt object that's large, as opposed to a planet as we think of the planets from Mercury out to Pluto?
It's an interesting question, and the difficulty is that astronomers have never come up with a formal definition of the word planet, and a formal scientific definition of the word planet. And right now there is a definition of the word planet, and it simply means the 9 things that we call planets. No one really expected to find something larger than Pluto, and so nobody was prepared to deal with the situation. So we're suddenly in a situation where clearly you found an object that's bigger. Now we have to go back and figure out what our words that we've been using for 2,000 years mean. And if it's pretty clear that this new planet is very much like Pluto. And so there's no question, I suspect, that it's going to be a rocky, icy body just like Pluto. It's a little bit larger than Pluto, not much larger than Pluto, maybe 20 or 25% larger than Pluto. And based on all of those facts, you should call it whatever you end up calling Pluto. If you want to call Pluto a planet, then you should call this a planet. If you don't want to call Pluto a planet, that's okay too, and then you shouldn't call this a planet either.
Well, so you've revised the original estimate of 1.5 times the size?
The original estimate was an upper limit based on some observations, and we realized shortly after those observations were taken that the telescope had inadvertently slightly missed pointing in the exact right spot. And so those limits turned out to have been meaningless. We didn't realize it at the time, but now we realize they were meaningless. So the number that I gave you is an estimate based purely on assuming that the object reflects as much as Pluto does. Since the surface appears to look like Pluto, we're going to assume that it reflects almost that same amount of sunlight, and so we can guess what the size is. It probably reflects the same amount of light as Pluto, and that makes it 20 or 30% larger than Pluto.
Okay, now what is it going to take in the astronomical community to finally define whether this Xena body is going to be called a planet or a Kuiper Belt object or whatever?
It's a good question. To be clear, it should always be called a Kuiper Belt object, just as Pluto should always be called a Kuiper Belt object. And the question is, do you want to say it's a planet that is also a Kuiper Belt object, or is it purely a Kuiper Belt object that's not a planet? What's it going to take? I actually think the answer is it's not going to take astronomers. Astronomers will continue to bicker about this forever, I suspect. And in the end, it will take the real definition of the word planet is a cultural definition, not a scientific definition. And so it's a decision that I think will be a cultural decision. If we as a culture accept this as a 10th planet, then it will be a 10th planet. And if we decide that there are only 8 planets and Pluto doesn't count, then that will be the way it is too. I think that's okay. I think a lot of scientists don't like that idea because they want to have control over words. But it's the same idea as the word continent. There is no scientific definition of the word continent. And if you ask geologists, they will tell you, well, continents are the 7 things that we call continents. And if somebody found something bigger than Australia, we'd call that a continent, too. And if they found something smaller, we wouldn't call it a continent. And geologists have gotten over worrying about scientific definitions of those words a long time ago. And I think it's time for astronomers to get over the same thing.
Now, what about its formal name?
That is a good question. The right now, it goes by the very unmelodious name 2003 UB313, and that name is purely a temporary designation that tells you when it was discovered and tells you nothing else.
And you're informally calling it Xena.
We always, when we find objects that we are tracking, we like to give them names internally so that we know what we're talking about. So when we're talking to each other, we don't get confused, because using numbers always confuses us. So we have always called it Xena to each other, not with the intention that anyone ever knew that that's what we called it, but no, the word has gotten out, so now everybody knows we call it Xena. A lot of people are confused and think that that's the name that it is formally going to have, and it's certainly not true. It is not a name that would be accepted for an object in the outer solar system. What the real name will be, I just don't know. It's going to come down to several different committees within the International Astronomical Union to decide what they want to call the object. Do they want to call it a planet or not? And then if it's a planet, what sort of name planets have, and if it's not, what sort of name these have. So I'm in the dark as much as everybody else on this one.
Can you give a peek preview on the names submitted?
Nope. Absolutely not.
In other words, a formal astronomy body must do that.
That's right.
Okay. So now let's move on to these other charming names, Sinister Forces, Santa, and Easter Bunny.
Now, those are actually both very interesting objects that have been completely overshadowed by the 10th planet, and they're actually not that much smaller. Each of those are probably somewhere around 2/3 or 3/4 the size of Pluto. So not quite Pluto-sized, but almost. And each of them is interesting in their own right. I'll start with Easter Bunny, which has an official informal name, temporary name also of 2005 FY9. But we always forget that too, so we just call it Easter Bunny.
And that's because it was found around Easter time.
It was found around Easter time. The very interesting thing about Easter Bunny is that it is, like Xena, it's actually very similar looking to Pluto. And now when I've just told you that there are these two objects that are very similar looking to Pluto, you might think it's not very uncommon. But a month ago, before anybody knew about these two, there was nothing similar to Pluto out in the Kuiper Belt. Everything else looked very different, and Pluto was very special in having this frozen methane on its surface, for example. And now suddenly there's a family of three objects which all look very similar, and it's going to help really understand. And instead of Pluto being a unique object that's difficult to understand, we now see that it's part of a family of objects, and we can try to understand this entire family, with Pluto being the middle-sized member of the three. That's very exciting to us.
And do they all three have odd orbits around the solar system?
All three of them do. Pluto has a very eccentric orbit and is tilted. Easter Bunny is tilted even more. Pluto's tilted by about 20 degrees. Easter Bunny is tilted by about 30 degrees. And Xena is tilted by about 40 degrees. So they're all very tilted, and they're all very eccentric.
And why?
We think it's because they have all had interactions with Neptune. Whenever we send a spacecraft out to study the outer solar system, we always fly that spacecraft by Jupiter and slingshot around Jupiter to get an extra little boost to send us out. And we think the same thing happened to these Kuiper Belt objects. They came close to Neptune, and they got a slingshot effect inadvertently, and they got flung out of the plane of the solar system a little bit.
And what about the possible hypothesis that something came through the solar system and caused these perturbations?
We don't think that explains these objects. We actually do believe that explains another of the objects that we discovered a year and a half ago, Sedna. Sedna is an entirely different beast from these four. It's much further out. Well, it's actually the same distance away as Xena is right now, interestingly enough. But it's on an orbit that takes it much, much further out away from the sun than these other objects. And it's beyond the Kuiper Belt. All of these objects are within the Kuiper Belt, and this one is well beyond the Kuiper Belt. And we think the only way that it could have gotten to where it is if a star came by and perturbed its orbit long, long ago. I don't think that that's necessary to explain these other orbits because we think we can do it just with the planets that we know of. So there's no need to invoke some other process.
Well, why would these 3 or 4 bodies have a methane crust?
That is the $64,000 question. There's a lot of methane in the outer solar system, and we don't understand why. And we are trying to figure that out right now.
And it showed up on Comet Tempo 1, right?
Right. There's methane seen in comets and many other things in the outer solar system.
And on the Earth, we often associate it with organic material, but it can be inorganic as well. What do you think is the source of the methane in all of these objects?
I actually don't have any good hypothesis for that right now. It's been sort of an unanswered question on Pluto for a long time, and it's one of those, for a long time, was one of those singular mysteries that people don't think about very much because there's no reason to think about it. But now we have a whole population out there. It's time to really put our thinking caps on and try to understand what happens.
So that amount of methane crust on at least 3 and possibly 4 bodies, if you include Sedna, is truly a big mystery in our solar system.
It is. It really is. And it's one that no one has really thought about very hard just yet.
Well, now, what about the Santa object?
Santa is actually perhaps my favorite Kuiper Belt object currently. And the reason is because it's large, like the other ones are, but it is a bizarre world. And the reason it's bizarre is because it is spinning once every 4 hours. And that is, it doesn't sound necessarily very fast, but imagine if the Earth were spinning once every 4 hours. It'd be a stranger place to live on if our days lasted 2 hours and our nights were 2 hours. Because it's spinning so fast, it has deformed itself into something that's shaped like a stubby cigar. And so this big stubby cigar that's almost the size of Pluto is spinning end over end in space.
Good heavens.
It's quite surprising. The other interesting thing about Santa is that it has a moon. Now, we were talking earlier about how if the 10th planet had a moon, we could determine the mass. Santa has a moon, and we have determined the mass of this object, and the mass is about 30% that of Pluto. So it's a little smaller than Pluto, but quite a high mass. The interesting thing about it is the combination of the high spin and the mass lets us figure out what's in the interior. And while for Pluto, we know that it's about half ice and half rock, and for Xena, I told you that we think that's probably going to be about the same answer. Santa is a very different answer. Santa is almost completely rock. And yet, when we look at the surface, all we see is frozen water. It looks like snow on the surface. So it looks like a large cigar-shaped rock that has just a surface layer, a very thin surface layer of water ice on it.
Well, have you gotten any elemental composition of this cigar-shaped object?
Only the surface. Unfortunately, there's no way we can figure out what the interior is made out of, other than we know that it's stuff that weighs the same as rock. It's dense like a rock is, and not light like ice is. So we know that it's probably typical rock like you would find around here, and that ice is just a thin layer.
We're borrowing from the X-Files. Is it possible that it might be something structured out of metal?
It's too light to be metal. So it actually works. It works out very well if it's rock and it's spinning at the rate that it does. It should turn into the cigar shape that it is. So it's all a very consistent story. So I think metal wouldn't work.
Is it the only cigar-shaped object that we know of in the solar system from the sun out through the Kuiper Belt?
It's the biggest one by far. There are some other objects in the Kuiper Belt that are also spinning very quickly that some other astronomers have determined that they believe that they're cigar-shaped. But in no other case is the object so big, or does it have a satellite around it. It's that moon around it that really lets us figure out exactly what's going on. So there has been speculative evidence for a while that there might be some smaller cigar-shaped things, but this one is wild. It's just it's almost the size of Pluto, and in fact, its length might be the same length as Pluto is in diameter.
Yeah,
it's spinning every 4 hours. It's a crazy place.
And why would it have such a rapid rotation?
I do know the answer to that, but I have a story that may or may not be true, and it involves the spin It involves the fact that it's almost entirely rock, and it involves the moon. And the way I put those three together is to think that initially Santa was much, much larger, and it was indeed half rock and half ice, as Pluto is. And it got hit by another object in the Kuiper Belt. When that happened, a lot of the ice melted and vaporized and disappeared. And it got hit so hard that it started spinning very rapidly. And as it got hit and it started spinning rapidly, it also spun off that tiny satellite, much in the same way that we think that the Earth and the Moon, that the Earth was hit by a sort of Mars-sized object, and the Moon was formed from that giant impact. I think that that's the same story, and I think that it consistently ties in all of these odd characteristics together.
I asked Dr. Brown if we were going to be able to get any photographs of either the Xena or the Easter Bunny or Santa. And they're going to try with Hubble, and hopefully in the next few months. And he said the problem is they are so far away, even though we think that Hubble can gather light so well, these are still small and far. And basically what we will be is at the limit of what we can see, and these will be slightly elongated dots on a screen that will change slowly over time. But at least with current equipment, we may never be able to fully see this intriguing cigar that is spinning once every 4 hours out there.
Well, Linda, it's absolutely fascinates me, and I just wonder what it actually is and how it got that shape, because, you know, he would never have said that it looked even faintly like something other than a natural object, because it would ruin his career. But I wonder what he really thinks.
Well, you know, that's why I asked him, borrowing from the X-Files, the real X-Files, could it be something structured? But, you know, there is an interesting fact that as we have been exploring more and more out in the Kuiper Belt, there have been these fast-spinning objects, and some of them, astronomers think, are also cigar-shaped, and it may be that his hypothesis that it is a function of being hit, and this is the interesting part. What is it that hit, or maybe not even physically hit, but came so close to objects out in the Kuiper Belt that it set them all spinning, or set a lot of them spinning rapidly, and that a few of them may have, as he says, melted from whatever this object was that came through, and in the spinning lost some of their mass, and that's what turned them into these cigar shapes. And that leaves another mystery. What was it that was large and collided or impacted or gravitationally affected this Kuiper Belt region?
Which gets us to Planet X.
That's right. This big Planet X sitting out there, and isn't it fascinating that in the 21st century, Whitley, it has provoked such a argument among the astronomy scientists about whether or not it should be called a planet, a Kuiper Belt object planet, or whatever. It still is almost amusing that we are still not even prepared to find an object larger than Pluto.
Well, Linda, thank you very much.
The reopening of the case, because an autopsy performed not too long ago on Frank Olson shows that he was murdered. He did not commit suicide. So this is only one case. Several other cases since then have turned up from the 50s. And our fear is that there are many more cases waiting to be exposed from the 1960s and 1970s.
Well, I believe that in 1977, Richard Helms, among the documents he destroyed in that year, he destroyed most, if not all, of the documents having to do with children, but that the program continued on. We're going to be going back and forth across history with Peter Levenda over the course of this program. We're going to go all the way back to witchcraft before Salem in the United States and all the way forward to the immediate future. So strap yourselves in, folks. It's going to be awesome. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Whitley Strieber's Dreamland online and on the IBC Radio Network.
This is Whitley Strieber. We're back with Peter Levenda. We were talking about a CIA mind control case, the Olson case, where it's now been proved that this man who allegedly committed suicide by jumping out of a window actually was murdered, almost certainly by the CIA. A little word has been used in the course of this conversation. That word has been the word secular. Secular, Peter, is, I've always felt, a profoundly disempowering word. The people who get into this, who open the door into the mind and therefore also into the world of the soul, who think of themselves as simply secular experimenters, are disempowering themselves and rendering themselves helpless. They are the sorcerer's apprentice. How do you react to that?
Well, I agree. If we insist on calling these procedures mechanistic, if we insist on looking at these types of techniques as strictly scientific, with all that implies in the modern day, then what we are doing is we're robbing these experiments of what they were really up to, what they were really doing, of what they really consist. Experimentation on the human mind is crossing right over into the territory of spirituality, of religion, of mysticism, of all the things that give meaning to our experience. Science is not a study of meaning whatsoever. Science and the...
I want to know this. Why is it? Let's get down to exactly what makes what you call the occult so dangerous, and why is it different from, for example, ancient nature religions and that sort of thing?
Well, that's a good question. I think that people reading my books quickly may come away with the opinion that I'm completely against the occult, and this is not so, but I am against the use of occult techniques by people with hidden agendas or ulterior motives, or people who are simply not trained well enough to understand what they're doing, as was the case with the people working under the CIA mind control operations in the military. They were in the same area, they were working in the same field, consciously or unconsciously, deliberately or not, as occultists have been for thousands of years, going back to the earliest recorded rituals that we know of ancient Egypt or Sumeria. So what we have is a spiritual process involving initiation, involving spiritual awareness, being forced upon victims, being forced upon people in a kind of gleeful experimentation just to see what would happen. To me, what was going on with American intelligence in the 50s, 60s, and until the present day is a kind of dramatic attempt to use magic, to use mysticism, to use all the techniques of the shamans and of the early nature religions in an effort to break open the human mind and to manipulate people, just as the way it was believed that magicians and witches during the Middle Ages were controlling people's minds or controlling people's destinies. CIA was researching all of the same material, as has been documented quite carefully, even in the sparse documents that have come out about MKUltra. It's obvious that they were working in the same territory, and there are a lot of victims, people who've suffered under this because there was no spiritual preparation, there was no follow-up, there was no attempt to create better people out of this. There was only an attempt to get the magical powers, which, as anyone knows, anyone will tell you, is a kind of black magic. When you pursue spiritual power for its own sake, just to have power over others, this is considered the very darkest form of spirituality. As they will tell you in India, in China, in the ancient religious techniques of shamanism, you pursue these things to better your community, to better yourself, to improve your relationship to the divine. You may obtain power, spiritual aspect to this, that there could be spiritual fallout. I don't think they cared. I mean, if we look at the experimentation by Dr. Cameron in Montreal, for instance, with all of his sleep deprivation and sensory deprivation experiments, his psychic driving experiments, he just drove people insane. He attempted to erase their memories and to rebuild other memories, to instill new memories. He did this without compunction. He thought he was doing a good thing. I mean, he was the president of the World Psychiatric Association, for crying out loud. So here was someone that we held above reproach who felt he was doing nothing wrong by reducing his patients to quivering masses of jelly. I mean, he had no conscience where this was concerned. So I don't think CIA really understood what they were up to. I think that they felt that this was mechanical and that whatever was broken they could fix. And of course, this is not true. I mean, the documents were destroyed. We don't know the people they worked upon. We don't know the names of these patients. They subjected violent offenders to massive amounts of hallucinogenic drugs and other types of mental and psychological conditioning, and then destroyed the records. So we don't know who's out there, what they're suffering from, or what this fallback is, and nobody at CIA seems to care about this, quite frankly, unless they're caught, as in the Frank Olson case or something like that. Nobody
Tell us about the Frank Olson case.
Well, Frank Olson was a scientist working with the military and with CIA out at Fort Detrick, which is where we did a lot of our chemical and biological warfare research. And this was in 1953. He was dosed with a small amount of LSD by Sidney Gottlieb, who at that point was working for the CIA in charge of their technical services division, which was experimenting with mind control technologies. And Olson was only one of several scientists who were, unknown to them, dosed with LSD in their Cointreau. Something happened to Frank Olson. He became extremely paranoid after this. He became very depressed. He wanted out of the military program that he was in. He had told his wife he made a terrible mistake. And with days of going around and telling everyone he wanted out, he was dead. He was thrown from a window in his hotel room in New York City and fell 10, 11 stories to his death. The death was covered up. It was considered a suicide until finally they revealed the information much, much later. CIA was forced to admit that he had been one of their mind control subjects. His family sued the government, and his son, Eric Olson, is still agitating for
a reason. When I first read Unholy Alliance, it was in paperback, a small format paperback, and it really was one of the most brilliant books about Nazism I had ever read in my life, that pointed out the occult underpinnings of the Nazi ideas and how this had led from the occult into Nazism and ultimately into the deaths of millions and the destruction of a large part of the human world, its most civilized heart, which has taken, of course, us a very long time to recover, but it hadn't ended there, according to Peter in Unholy Alliance. It had gone on and does continue to go on. Now, his book, Sinister Forces, the most incredible history of the United States I have ever read, bar none. End of story. Welcome, Peter, to Dreamland.
Thank you very much for having me, Whitley.
Peter, tell us, if you will, to begin, and we're going to float back and forth through history, folks, with this. You call this book, Sinister Forces, a grimoire of American political witchcraft. And we'll get to why you call Book 1 the 9 in a few minutes. But what is a grimoire?
Well, a grimoire is a book of spells. It's a book of rituals used by magicians, normally used for raising spirits or for doing almost anything a magician would do. I use it here in this case because I feel that it's a collection of information concerning cults that have been involved in American history over the years. And it's also a kind of a guide to some of the occult beliefs and practices that I think exist in this country in official and semi-official and unofficial ways. So it pretty much covers a wide range of spiritual techniques and practices that I believe were being utilized by, for instance, American intelligence during the infamous MKUltra affairs, by the military as well during some of the same types of research into mind control, brainwashing, psychological warfare, that sort of thing.
It's a world that I have had a lot to do with in different ways. It has affected me, tried in a sense to capture me as a child, sent itself after me in different ways. I have been negatively affected by
abilities, psychic abilities along the way, but you should not pursue occultism for that purpose or for that sake. With CIA and with the military in our country and in other countries around the world, we're not the only ones, an attempt was made to look at this from a very behavioristic point of view. The scientists said, well, let's take all of this out of its religious context, out of its spiritual context, and see what we can do with it. Can we erase memory? Can we manipulate memory? Can we take over the will of an individual? Can we make a person do things they wouldn't ordinarily do? And then erase the memory of it. These were things CIA admitted in 1975 that they had tried to do. So, to me, this is a form of occultism run amok. Occultism in the hands of government agents. What is the worst combination you can think of but a spiritual movement in the hands of government bureaucrats?
Now, did they simply not believe that anything else was there in this? And here's how I mean that. I have gained a lot of those powers, frankly. I've written about this in my journals, some on my website. I do not use them in this way at all, and never would use them to influence another person. And I'm in a very difficult position now, because I know that I could use them to influence certain people in high places, but who are doing things wrong. But should I? And that's a moral question I really haven't answered yet, because I do know there is something back there. There is something behind the curtain that will use me if I use it. Did the CIA people, were they aware of this presence, if you will, at all, or were they simply so secular that they were blind to it and just experimenting like kids let loose in a candy shop that turned out to be full of poison pills?
Well, I think that they began as sorcerers' apprentices, basically, if we remember the Walt Disney film. I think they began trying to make the brooms dance, and in the end they found themselves surrounded by the fallout of what they were doing. I don't think initially they realized what they were up to. I think they had a purely behavioristic approach, a purely mechanical approach to the human mind, and they said, let's open it up and see what we can see. And there had been other groups, organizations, and traditions down through the ages that claimed to have these abilities or powers or these technologies. And CIA said, let's go and take a look and see what we can do. I don't think they understood or recognized that there is a spirit